What's good, everybody? My name is Alckemy. We are going to be talking about drums today with processing from only the basic drum stuff. You can get some really good results out of it. You're going to have to put some work into it. This is going to be a talking head video where I'm really just going to be probably spending more time talking than I am going to be putting out actual sound. But if you like lectures and you want to sit down and learn about drums and stuff, especially if you're a beginner, then hopefully you and I can have some fun together. If you're really keen on how to make the biggest and baddest drums that I personally know how to make, kind of like this, then I would invite you to check out the Arcana memberships, just because I have a ton of stuff both on drums, on Neurobase. I'm working on a halftime course right now, just a bunch of stuff that will constantly be updated, and that's where like all of my secrets are. With that being said, a like and subscribe and a comment goes a long way as well. This was actually inspired by one of my YouTubers, goes by the name of Paul Gavin. Shout out to you, dude, who has been asking me to do a lot of stuff within Bitwig. But yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, because I'm going to be doing this from scratch. So if you're like, oh, I just want to see the result, then I don't know, skim to the end or something and then come back. At least leave a like or on the video or something. But we've got a kick and snare. Just, you know, a very simple beat. It's nothing special. E-kick and E-snare on their own actually seem like they are very unimpressive, which is kind of the funny thing and the ironic thing, because on paper they are, but on the other side of things, they're actually very good for what we're going to talk about first, which is fundamentals. So if we just take a look at this kick here, maybe. This is actually a very decent fundamental. And what's interesting about this is that this is actually usable from the get-go as a fundamental, because it's actually pretty clean. Generally speaking, let's just go ahead and kind of take you through the crash course of things. When you're talking about transients, you want this to be the loudest part of the sound, and then it dwindles down kind of like a Dorito chip. So if you're kind of trying to look at something via oscilloscope or whatever, then design a kind of Dorito chip thing. Those rules can be broken, and in some cases should be broken, depending on how, like, what kind of drums and stuff you like to make. For example, this does not look like a Dorito chip. This is a big giant doof. And it's really important to say that everything is subjective. It's a matter of character, but there's certain reasons why things work. There's certain reasons why things sometimes don't work. And remember to break the rules at all times for the sake of finding your own artistry. So, you know, once you learn a structure, then you can break it. In regards to drum and bass and neurofunk and stuff, when you're talking about these fundamentals, they are the basic, usually the basic sine waves, triangle waves, sometimes even square waves of a sound that carry the thump and the tone, or I guess really there's no other way to describe it other than fundamental of your drum. So for example, if we have something like this, right, and I were to go and grab a break, then what I would think about is maybe something kind of like this, where I've got my fundamental over here, this is a kick, and then this acoustic snare is supported by a fundamental under that. And you could high pass this, or you could sidechain it, or whatever, but typically speaking, like, that is the secret to layering breaks. Long story short is, whenever you're kind of doing this kind of thing, you want to make sure to have a strong fundamental under that. And the reason why is just because it helps support the thump, it helps support the energy of your kick and snare and fundamental and stuff. And I will say that this only applies to like your fundamental hits, which is kick and snare, maybe a clap, but break the rules, right? So with that being said, now that we kind of have a basic understanding about how some of these drums and stuff work, you don't really actually have to go that far in order to get a clean sound, because what you should be aiming for this is not how to turn something into a snare that's like, which is always fun to do, but you're not really working with much. So instead, focus on building strong fundamentals that you can later resample, which I'll show you something outside of Bitwig, or I'll show you some other kind of processing that you can do quickly in order to get that. With that being said, let's talk about the kick. It's nothing special, but what we are going to do first is we are going to distort the heck out of it. So with the distortion aspect, there's a few different options that we can use. Only a few of them are actually from Bitwig, so we're actually going to start with this one. You guys are sleeping on this one. I'll just say that much. Like, there's actually some really cool things that you can do with this, and it doesn't sound as bad as you think. You just have to be mindful about how much drive you turn into it, because usually it starts at like 50 or something. Oh no, that's almost the top. But usually it's like here, and that's 25 dB of drive. Turn it down and then slowly start to reintroduce it, and you'll see what I mean. This looks like a high pass, so we really just want to take the low end of it. And we're going to decrease the decay of this. I'm going to turn up my speakers. And without really having to do a whole lot of work, if you just solo this, then it's actually a whole lot better. So something that we can also do, I almost reached for Pro Q, is grabbing an EQ plus, or any of these. Actually, we can probably just use EQ5, and we want to just grab a low pass here, and we're just going to thump this and maybe make this a little bit. And now let's go ahead and grab another distortion and move this over. And we want to actually back off of this one quite a bit. Now, if you want to keep the high end on there, then there's a couple of things that you can do. The first one is we can talk about how I use OTT. I typically don't do this, but what you can do is you can grab the high end here, and you can grab the dynamics. And then you can actually push the ratio down on this. And then move the threshold down as well. And you can see that this is actually boosting the high end. And for whatever reason, if this isn't biting through hard enough, there's a few ways that we can solve this. For one, you can actually add just a touch of white noise from something like a bit crusher, but you want to be really subtle with it. Because you can hear how it's kind of giving it. The other thing that you can do is you can actually use this as a clipper, but we'll do that at the end of this. So let's say, like, you know, you've got your white noise and all that stuff in here, and that's like the one thing that this doesn't have, which is it does have a click, but it doesn't have a white noise generator, to which you might want to actually consider using something like FM4, but I mean, use what you have, it's fine. I wouldn't recommend the click though, as you can hear. So with this, you can actually repeat this a couple of times if you want to, and kind of like mix and match and do all that stuff. But with just a couple of distortion processing and compression stuff, you can actually get pretty far. The other thing that we are going to do is we are going to use, sorry, I always reach for the glue. We're going to use, you're going to see me do that a lot in this video. So we're going to grab a compressor here, and I'm just going to play with this on both sides, but you want to pull the threshold way down, pull the threshold up, and a longer attack is going to result in more punch. Long release is generally good because that means it's going to take a long time for this to come back or for the compressor to open. So it's actually going to shorten your tail a bit. Now, the last thing that we can kind of think about with this is, well, we can do a few different things. I'm going to try not to get into resampling, but you can actually use that same bit crusher here as a soft clipper or hard clipper. I think hard clipping usually is what I want to go for, but maybe try soft clipping. Now we destroyed it, which is fine, but sometimes that's going to happen. And with this, you can actually see that we've created that chip again. I say that like the Dorito chip. The other thing that you can do as well, which I wouldn't really recommend, is you can go into glue compression, which you can use the dynamics. I wouldn't really say that this is glue compression because it doesn't model after an SSL, but it does have some interesting features because this is a low and high, and so you can kind of pull this up if you want to and create kind of a curve like this that is kind of reminiscent of something you might know about. Yeah, you can definitely also use the Saturator if you want to, but this doesn't do true clipping. So, and I find that this is a little bit more finicky to work with when you're trying to get stuff in that way. So I actually typically just use the distortion model. But what you can do is you can, again, set your long attack, your long release, and then turn your threshold down on both. And you can see, like, we've already made a bunch of different kinds of kicks and stuff, so. But we've reduced the output significantly on here. It says that anyways. Maybe not, but that's why you can always just grab a limiter. I do have a limiter on the master channel, but, you know, use your own judgment. So this would not be a good kick, because this has like a baby fundament or like a baby transient, and then this opens up. So what's happening is that this is hitting the limiter and then it's coming back in because of the long release. And something like this would be better. Or you can just leave it as is. And kind of the thing with shaping drums and transients in general is it's really kind of a matter of, how do you say, envelopes and timing and distance, or I guess like time, right? Because how long do you want your kick to be? How do you want to, like, what kind of character do you want your kick to have and stuff? So if for whatever reason this is too short, then you can mess with this stuff and mess with the settings of the attack and the release on some of these. So maybe pull back on the release a bit. And you see how this kind of lengthened that out a bit. If I pull the release higher, then you can see that it's kind of shaping it to be a little bit smaller. And it's not making the biggest difference, but it does make enough of a difference to say like, oh, hey, this does this, this does this. So check this out. You can see that the tail end of this has been extended and kind of like lengthened out a little bit more. You can also try turning off the makeup gain, because even though this makes it more quiet, this actually gives you some headroom to work with. And if for whatever reason your kick does not have enough thump, so let's go ahead and take a look at, I'm going to use Pro Q on this. We're not going to actually design with this, but just for sake of visualization. See that? That's the click of your kick. This is your fundamental. So you can use that sometimes as an EQ to start to boost, and placing that in certain places will also help bring that out. So for example, we've got this little guy over here. If, oh shit, if I were to move this over and maybe create this guy, this is why I typically don't use EQ plus for specific things like that, because while this it looks really nice and it's cool, the representation of the grid doesn't necessarily reflect what it is that I'm trying to find. So even if I set this to the fastest, it's still not quite as, I guess, like reflective visually as Pro Q in general. But now that you have something like this, you can also play around with where you place this. And you can see here that this is starting to look more kind of like a doof. So let's go ahead and recap why I did this, or what this is supposed to be about. And really what it is you are trying to use a very rudimentary sound, which would just be a sine wave and some white noise, and sending it through distortion and compression and envelope shaping and stuff, and boosting the fundamental harmonic is going to help kind of bring this into having a little bit more of a punch. And it doesn't really seem that much because you have been along with me on the journey this entire time, but if you listen to this, I personally like the second one better, even though this one has a little bit more of a click. And the reason why it has a click, or it doesn't have a click, is because we took the click away. So, which you can do this as well if you want. Or you can find something in the middle. And now once you have this processing chain, you can actually come into this as well and start to like change it up as well. You might want to make different kicks, but check this out. You see how much of a difference that makes when you're talking about shaping these envelopes and pitching and stuff. And to kind of like summarize this, it's really just a matter of distortion, compression, and EQ, which is something I learned from Audica a long time ago. And that is something that you want to consider whenever you are making fundamentals. Now, I will say that like you do have to put a little bit more work into this as opposed to using something like a third-party program or like a third-party plugin. For example, like the glue just has a particular characteristic about it. I'm also going to show you the Saturator, which is my favorite for hard clipping. This thing is pretty amazing. You can crunch this pretty hard and get some really cool results. Soft clipping in general, if you have access to a free one like FreeClip, will help out a lot. The problem with the soft clipper on bit 8 is it's a little bit more difficult to work with because it wasn't designed for that, and it also turns the signal down. So if you take a look at this, I know that I kind of went on a tangent here, but this is again kind of like a masterclass setting, but take a look at this kick before I actually saturate this. We're going to turn the soft clipping on, and I want you to take a look over at the left where we're looking at the track volume. So that turns this down by at least 6 dB, which is cool. It just means that you have to bring it back up. But again, it doesn't work necessarily as intended, right? Even still, that's still -4. Which you can even do something like that too if you wanted to. And really, like, I'm showing you this because this process is kind of never ending. It's really just a matter of shaping kind of like distorted sine waves, I guess, for lack of better description. But, you know, if you wanted to keep this process going, you can kind of just... Sorry, I wanted to high cut. Yeah, so, you know, you can even use something kind of like that if you wanted to. Now back to what I was saying, if you have access to like a dedicated hard clipper or something, look at the waveform here, how it's kind of short. It's like a pure square wave now, which is kind of funny, but this is why this makes a big difference, and it's important to kind of recognize, because now we're getting something kind of like this. This is before the saturator. And you can just hear how that adds a little bit more knock to it. Same thing with the glue. If we compress the heck out of this, we turn on the peak clipping, which is pretty much soft clipping. Your mind says, hey, that's a square wave, but the knock and the kick of it is also like super thick. So there's something to be considered there. And for whatever reason, you can always kind of come into this and decrease the decay as this becomes a... And even this is on the whole entire drum group, so even the snare is kind of benefiting from this. But understanding these tools and understanding that while they are the same, technically they have different algorithms is really important. But don't think that you can't get something cool out of this in general. It's just a matter about being mindful of what you're doing. And once you kind of have that understanding, then you should be able to shape some pretty strong fundamentals with your kick. I kind of move this around just to... Because even still, this actually sounds like more quiet, but... and it is, respectively, but if you were to turn this back up, say, let's just say like I use like a tool, or maybe I use the limiter again, and I try to pull this up a little bit more. See? even with the, or even without the soft clipper that I use, and even without the glue compressor that I use, you can see that you actually still get quite a bit out of your fundamental in that way. And again, this is just for your bass sound. So if you're just trying to, or like your fundamental sound. So, and once you have something like this, for whatever reason, like I know that this is pretty insane, but you can always just fade this in whenever you bounce this to audio. So if I were to Command J and we look at that square looking chonker right there, you can always just create that same taco or tortilla chip, or what the heck ever you want to call it, by adding that fade. And when we double click on this, you'll see that as we kind of scoop in, it gets a little bit better. And you can control like the kinds of fades that you want to do in general. And I'm very comfortable with showing you the resampling aspect of this because of how easy it is to resample in Bitwig in the first place. But you can always just do something like this as well. Kind of like so. And just make that really sharp like that. And again, when you zoom out, you kind of take a look at that. It's starting to look more like what you want it to. Or not, you know, or you can just kind of leave it be and keep it long or whatever, but you still have a lot more to work with. So don't necessarily worry if you kind of squarify things in general. I typically actually like to have, again, like if you look at these dupes and stuff that I make, I bet a lot of engineers and stuff would be like, dude, your drums, man, like you got problems. But even still, hold on. That one has a little bit more of a transient on it. Even still, this guy, I lost it, but it's still squarified. If you look right here, you can see that the clipping is applied and it looks less like a sine wave and more kind of like a soft square. So again, like don't be afraid to like just, dupes are relatively easy, or kicks in general. If you're trying to create like a really fat kick, you just kind of have to be mindful about, you know, having something like that in general. You can create a click with this as well if you want. You just have to either you can do click, which is one thing. The other thing that you can consider is that you can actually offset the phase whenever you bounce something. So right now the phase of this is starting at 0 and then kind of wobbling out. This is the speaker pushing outward. This is the speaker kind of sucking in, and this is your 0 crossing. And so long story short, without trying to get too scientific, if you start a sample, see how it starts at 0, but if you start a sample here that is kind of not on the 0 crossing, something kind of like that, then you should technically introduce some kind of click, as you can see there. So yeah, lots of cool information about like drums and stuff, and I like to geek out over this stuff. Drums and bass are what I spend the most time designing and whatnot, but these are just like some general info tips and stuff with Bitwig and I guess Neurofunk or whatever at a glance about how you can shape these and stuff. And we haven't really talked about like resampling and processing and whatnot, but you know, we're using a very basic waveform and figuring out how to pull more out of it. And hopefully you're not like, hopefully your takeaway isn't like, oh, I'm going to know how to make this kick. It's more of like, hey, here's some stuff that you can use in order to find your own. It's about the process. It's not always necessarily about the end result. So yeah, we've got our kick done-ish. Super loud, pretty funny. But now let's go ahead and talk about our snare. So our snare fundamental has a sine wave and noise as well, but the biggest difference between the two is that the snare is actually higher pitched up. So if you look right here towards the bottom bar, I'm pointing at it with my finger, but it says oscillator 1 tuning. It says that this is tuned at A sharp 2. One really common thing that you can do is you can use, like if your fundamental is in, let's say, E flat, because I've been making a lot of music in E flat, using your snare at a fifth is a really typical common practice. And the reason why is because I guess just like tonally it works. but honestly, like, you can use that from like a guide point and then throw it out the window, because we're going to be using like frequency shifters and stuff with this at some point anyways. But yeah, if like you're really worried about tuning drums and stuff, then you can do that. I start there, but I usually just like veer off the deep end and make the snare sound cool, not necessarily make the snare sound harmonic. So with this though, one really important thing to consider is that the relationship between your noise and your fundamental, both with your kick and your snare, are very, very important when it comes to like what you send into an EQ, what you send into a distortion and stuff. Because like, let's say your fundamental's too loud and you don't have enough noise, then it's going to muffle it out, and that's going to shape the way that you know, how do you say it? It's going to shape the way that that stuff comes out. So with this, we've got oscillator 1, oscillator 2. It kind of has an offset, and this is just kind of how you can create more of like an actual snare tone. So for example, if the offset is like this, and we take a listen to the snare on its own, I think I can just do this. You can hear that it actually has a fundamental, right? But the more that we offset this, it sounds almost like a touch of FM or so. And I don't think that's what it is, but I typically don't mess with that. However, with the noise and shaping this, you kind of want to think about creating the same kind of relationship with your fundamental tone, also with your snare, because this is going to dictate whether or not this is going to come out and crack, or whether it's going to be really short and techy, or vice versa. So if you send this into a distortion, you've got a longer attack, then that little ksh is eventually going to become a smack. If you do it like this, then you can see that it's going to be less fundamentally tonal, and it's going to be more of kind of like just some kind of like crackling noise or something like that. So envelopes, man, envelopes. So this other thing that I added here, I guess I'll just do it from scratch, is something that I was experimenting with. I wasn't really sure if that was going to work or not, but I was just trying to put an envelope follower on the resonance here with both of these to see if they do anything. And it does seem to affect the sound a little bit, but not enough to where it's significant and substantial. So this filter right here only dictates the noise, I believe. Oh no, it dictates the whole thing. So as opposed to like trying to shape this the way that you want it, I would back off of this and just leave this at full force. And then if you're on a computer keyboard or something, also turn the velocity down on both, so that way you're going to get the same thing every time. But one thing that's interesting about this is that I think that the noise generator is random, because you can see that every time I play this, the waveform changes. We're not getting the same thing over and over again, which is a bit of a bummer, but that's something that you're going to have to be mindful of. So let me pull this up a little bit more. And now you've got some jumbled mess that doesn't really tell us anything, other than it's a really weak and pathetic snare. The first thing that I'm going to do is the same thing that I always do, which is add some distortion. Again, this is your high pass. This is your high pass. This is your low pass. So let's just make this full. You can see that our fundamental is here, and it has a nice balance with our high end here. So that means that we can distort the entire sound and not worry too much about it. At a certain point, you can hear that this is actually starting to make the fundamental ring out more. Not so good. So be mindful about when you do that. And on good phase rotations, this actually looks pretty decent. So with that, what we're going to do now is we're going to try not to destroy the transient too much. And some of you guys might be asking me why I don't use a transient shaper, and that is because a lot of times you end up overdoing it. And it doesn't actually give me what I want. So I figured that usually with compression, and yeah, compression is usually what I go for to help me shape my transients in the first place. But yeah, so the next piece of this puzzle would be to grab some kind of EQ. we can use EQ5. And one trick that I got from both Chi and Cage is taking your fundamental. Not too much though. Actually sounds pretty good. I'm gonna reduce this, or actually turn up the resonance of this just a bit while I reduce this out. Oh, those are doing the same thing. And then I'm going to actually pull up the high end of this just a bit. You know, that actually doesn't sound bad. Let's go ahead and throw a frequency shifter on it. Now, the frequency shifter on this is really weird because as opposed to something like kilohearts to where it doesn't even have a dedicated mix knob, which I find is actually better for stuff like this, is this just says, how much do you want to shift this by, right? Whereas this says you have a range. So this means that between, let's just do 100 hertz. You set a range of 100 hertz and this will shift in between that 100 hertz, I think both positively and negatively. Yeah, so this says minus 100% and then plus 100%. So typically what you want to do is maybe just set something like, I don't know, just shoot for 30 hertz-ish and then see what you get. And this is actually pretty good, at least as far as a fundamental standpoint. And what I would say now is that you can see that our kick is way longer than our snare. So talking about the relationship between these two and stuff, what you can always get into after that is some kind of dynamic shaping to where, okay, sure, we can bring back our transient shaper now. Oop, not that one, sorry. And we can grab some kind of thing to pull off the tail on this. So you want to pull the time back and then you want to pull the gain back. Or you can always look into compression as well. So if you don't want to do that, then what you can do is you can shape it via that. You can use a transient shaper if you wanted to. You can stack transient shapers if you wanted to. That's a little bit overkill, but you can. You can also compress it again if you want, and you can maybe do that before the limiter because, yeah. Also be mindful about makeup gain. This is something that isn't always the best choice. Try to maybe just start here. So yeah, there's a lot of different shaping things that you can do with that. And then of course, like I said, like you can also apply your frequency shifter at the end of this as well. And at this point, we're just kind of discussing options about how to continue, whatever, how to talk about options between this, right? So you can do really only maybe like this much, because this is going to change the sound so drastically when it comes to fundamentals, but sorry, when it comes to kicks. So be really mindful about that. But when you take a look at this and you actually grab the whole thing and you bounce this out to audio, you've actually got some pretty solid fundamentals, and you can use this for further resampling. So for example, you can throw something like this, like insane. Let me try to think about what's the most. You can do something kind of like this when you want to start coloring this stuff up. You can use a convolution and set this to 100% mix, like so, and then we can just find something very simple. I'm going to solo this. Then we can grab some distortion. And this is only just like a, I guess, very short demonstration, so. On there if you want. Actually, you can do that with this. And then you can do that same thing that we talked about from before with the frequency shifter. Oh, sorry, let's use this one. then what you can do is you can layer this under here by high passing this, and from there there's a lot more that you can do, like, and you can just kind of continue to like bounce this out and create different variations, and this comes into your sound design creativity and whatnot. But right. So of course these are kind of clashing with each other because there is some kind of, you know, I guess, how do you say, some kind of transient and low end that's happening, even though we're kind of cutting this out. But you can always change the impulse as well. That's awesome. So even though I wouldn't necessarily use it on the kick, we found like a really cool texture for that. So you can see that just by, you know, tossing this through a few effects, you can start to do this and layer this over and over and over again. So with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about the second piece of this now, which is hats. Hats are much, much easier, and the only reason why I wanted to kind of go through this was because, how do you say, it's pretty much just like design this and then create like the shuffle. So let's go just do something kind of like this. And I'm actually going to design a ride first, because this is typically what is going to help kind of keep the tempo. So all you have to really do is just kind of mess again with the envelopes. Just a little bit of chorus. One thing that you can do is, if you really want these to sound like messed up, then you can do that same distortion, and you can add a tremolo. So there's that. Now when it comes to hats and stuff, it's kind of all the same thing. So what we're going to do is we're just going to design a quick hat pattern. That's something else, but and really what you want to think about is just making two different hats. So maybe even something like this, and we can even start small, where we do something here to where we're just looping this little guy. And And even still, right, we can that one's a little. Now we've created a shuffle. And then what we can do is on that last one, we can go something kind of like that. And now we're going to process the whole thing together. Use some saturation. We can use a little bit of EQ here. Oh, I grabbed the wrong one, sorry. And then now you can kind of just mix this in to how loud you want this to be. Just gonna find something quickly that works. You can compress these a bit. Then you can get into the same thing that we were talking about from before, where we go into that aspect of convolution, and then you can kind of start creating your variations from here. Suddenly from the E-kick we have created something kind of like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these here. EQ to this if you want. But I find that the sidechain, I'm using EQ here, but the sidechain should take care of quite a bit of that. But in essence, this is pretty much how you go about using eKick to to designing something almost completely different and interesting. So yeah, if anybody has any questions about any of this stuff, like these are all just possibilities. And I know that I kind of stopped talking like towards the end, but really with this, it's kind of just a matter of like listening to it and working on it and applying the same tricks and stuff that we did from before. And when you do this, you're most likely like not going to get this kind of result, especially if you are a beginner. But I will say that between the tools that you have with Bitwig and other things, like you can definitely get some cool sounds. It's really just a matter about being creative and cheeky with how you make stuff. Because what we started with was just, let me turn this off, solo this rather, but we really started with almost nothing, which was this to this. And we actually didn't even have that. We had so when you listen to the actual difference between that, that's why having a fundamental is so important. Convolution reverb is also your best friend, but it doesn't have to be convolution reverb. You can actually use different kinds of reverb. You can use different effects, right? You can use like ring mod. You can use stuff that's more digital. You can use bit crushing depending on how you want it to be. Like there's not really any end to how you do stuff with this. And I kind of just wanted to give you my own perspective on this stuff. I'm not saying that these drums are amazing. I'm not saying that they're the best, but they definitely sound a whole lot better than they did before. So with that being said, if you guys like this video, then do me a favor and like and subscribe, and check out the other masterclasses that I have on the more in-depth stuff that I'm working with. But if you guys want to support the channel, alckemy.com, become a member. I don't really have anything else that I want to talk about, but hopefully you guys feel a little bit more inspired to just exclusively work within Bitwig now. Thanks, guys. I'll see you in the next one.